Hello, and welcome once again to the Justin Center podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper, and thank you so much for joining me once again on the program, as always. And I do want to give you just a quick reminder that Justin Center, as an organization, is supported by donors. So if you have benefited from the things that we do here, and you would like to see these things continue, we would ask that you consider becoming a regular contributor. You can go to justincenter.org and go to our donate page, and you can figure out how to help us out in a number of ways here. Now, I want to just quickly mention a couple things before I jump into the topic today. The first of those is just a reminder that we have now started a new YouTube channel for the Widener Institute. The Widener Institute is the theological institute of Justin Center. It's kind of the academic wing of Justin Center. And if you go on that channel, you're going to find videos for not just me, but all of the fellows involved with the Widener Institute. So it's a way to connect with hear some other Lutheran scholars and pastors share their own theological information on various issues. So highly encourage you to subscribe to the Widener Institute if you have not. It's Weidner. All right, so along with that, I do want to just quickly mention that we have a really exciting new book release. I'm very excited about this. And this is a book called The Lutheran Catechism, Law, Gospel, Discipleship. It's a 6-month daily devotional with questions and prayers. So this was edited by John Allen Schmidt. This has been in the works for quite a while now with Justin Center. I know some of you have really been waiting for this volume. For those who aren't familiar with what this is, essentially, this is a 6-month devotional that is based upon Luther's small and large catechisms. So it goes through the entirety of Luther's small catechism. And along with each of the questions and answers that are included in Luther's catechism, it also includes further, more detailed explanations from Luther's large catechism. Along with that, it has prayers for each of the days, and it also has some meditation questions. So this can be used either as kind of a personal study, read through a little bit each day, or it is really useful for family worship if you are trying to find a way to kind of incorporate scripture reading and prayer with your family. It's not too intensive. It's a quick read every day, but it's keeping you in the Word. It's keeping you, in instruction and catechesis with your children, so that you are teaching them the Ten Commandments, the Apostles' Creed, as well as the sacraments, and it gives you questions that you can really try to discuss with your family and kids. So this is a great volume. You can go to justincenter.org if you want to pick up a copy. Currently only in paperback, but we are going to have a hardcover volume coming out as well, and we will have it in Kindle edition. A book like this probably is not best in Kindle edition as an ebook, but hey, nonetheless, we're going to have it anyway. So if you are one of those people that really only wants to read ebooks, then we're going to have it there too. So we've got some other exciting announcements of books as well, and there are going to be some videos on the YouTube channel here about some of the other publications that we have just re-released and some other new releases coming up soon. Okay, all of that background. Now let's jump into the topic today. Well, we are going to be discussing a book that's been talked about quite a bit in political circles, in conservative circles, in theological and social circles. It's really had a pretty broad impact and broad discussion across a lot of different fields. And my field here primarily is theology, that we delve into philosophy and cultural issues. And this particular topic is going to be more along the political, cultural issue side of things, but it is all extremely theologically relevant, and we're going to talk about that as we go through this. Now, this book was published in 2018. It got pretty popular at the time, and it had an endorsement, strangely enough, from former President Barack Obama. He added it to his, kind of to-read book list or recommended book list, and there was an endorsement from Barack Obama on the back of the book, which is odd because Deneen is notably a conservative thinker. So just to give you an idea of the broad range of individuals that have really have said positive things about Deneen's work. Now, Deneen had a more recent book called Regime Change that just came out this year. I've not read Regime Change yet, but essentially what this book is it is a critique of some of the foundational principles of Enlightenment Liberalism, and these are some fundamental principles that we in the Western world, especially in the United States, tend to take for granted today. And something that I have tried to do in a lot of my work in all the fields that I look into, whether it's theology or philosophy or some of these cultural issues, is I try to evaluate and get people to reevaluate what are their fundamental basic commitments that they are bringing to the table. What are the kinds of assumptions that you are bringing to the table as you're discussing whatever it is that you are interested in, or as you're entering into a debate. And I've always had an interest in going back to some of those basic principles and saying, let's make sure that our basic principles are correct. The assumptions that we're making, which are often unconscious assumptions. We often don't know or realize that we have some of the assumptions that we do. So this book, I think, is really helpful in that regard. And what it does is it helps us to outline what it is that in the post-Enlightenment Western world, especially for those in the Anglo world who are indebted to social contract theory, it helps us to see what some of the primary assumptions are that we use to evaluate the world. And these assumptions are really far-reaching. And that's what Deneen tries to show, and I think he does it successfully. So that doesn't mean I agree with everything that Deneen says, or I agree with everything in this particular book. But I think that he does successfully demonstrate what some of those assumptions are and lead us to see what are some of the challenges that we face in all different spheres in our society. And so that certainly affects how the church functions, but it also affects family, it affects culture, it affects education, and really all of the different spheres that God has created in this world. Liberalism starts to really shift the conversation in the West in a very different way than it ever had been previously, whether in the classical period or the Middle Ages. So what I'm going to do is start a discussion here today. We'll see how far we get. What I put together in terms of the PowerPoint here is really just from the beginning chapter, the beginning chapter of Deneen's book. So it's kind of setting the groundwork for what are the broader issues that he deals with. And then he does get pretty particular in getting into how these assumptions affect all sorts of different fields. And so we may delve further into that. It just kind of depends, I guess, on what the reception is. So if you're interested in doing this further, I think some of this will be pretty similar to what we did on the series on Carl Trueman's book, where we looked at the rise and triumph of the modern self. So this is going to be something kind of similar to that. Now that I'm using PowerPoints, though, this is probably going to be easier to have some kind of way to follow along with what the heck I'm talking about, at least for those who are watching the video. But hopefully those who are just listening to the audio podcast can still follow my thought better, since I actually have something written down. I'm not like flipping through a book between recording clips, so that I know what I'm talking about, because I have it all right here. So just so you know, as I go through what I'm going to basically be doing is going through certain quotes in the book and discussing the concepts that are inherent in those quotes. This is not just a summary of Deneen, but I'm giving plenty of my own thoughts as well as I'm talking about this. So what I read through here was not a physical book. It was an ebook edition. I tend to read books when it comes to philosophy or politics or culture. Pretty much all of those books I read in ebook form. The only reason for that is that I have really full bookshelves and my office is not that big. so sometimes I just need to buy things in ebooks, or it would just be piles of books around me, and maybe the floor would cave in. I don't know. I read a lot, so and I love books. So I to some extent have to read some things on as ebooks. So for whatever that's worth. But the good thing about that is that I've been able to take screenshots basically of all the pages, and it makes it a lot easier. So we're going to be looking through specific things as we move through this. I know that's a long background, but we are getting into the actual meat of things, I promise. Okay, let's talk then about Patrick Deneen, the author of this particular book, who he is, and why we're talking about this. Why is he important? Or is he important? Or is this just some kind of random book? Patrick Deneen was born in 1964. And he has a pretty impressive teaching career. He has a very significant place, I think, in public life, at least in certain realms. Certainly, he has to be somewhat influential in order to, get the ear of someone like a former president of the United States. He taught as an assistant professor of government at Princeton University. He was there from 1997 to 2005. He then was an associate professor of government at Georgetown University, another very reputable university from 2005 to 2012. And currently he is professor of political science at Notre Dame from 2012 until today. And I've heard some things from people that have taken classes with him that that they really love him as a professor. So he's as far as I know, he's quite a beloved professor there at Notre Dame. Now, he is most well known for his writings. He was a founding editor of the Front Porch Republic, which is a broadly conservative publication, but one that is more focused on things like localism than it is on, they say nationalist politics, like like Hazony and kind of his group. Though this was, of course, prior to NatCon existing. But he has written for a number of publications that are probably well known among both theological and broadly conservative readers, and that would be things like First Things, The American Conservative, The New Atlantic. Deneen is very much a Catholic thinker. He's a Roman Catholic, and that comes across significantly in his writings and the kinds of things that he talks about, which is why this is something that I think is relevant to the kind of work that we do with Just and Sinner. It's important to be part of some of these broader conversations. And I think it's important to have a Lutheran voice, or many Lutheran voices in some of these broader conversations that are impacting our culture as well. We can't only let the Roman Catholics get involved in this stuff. So, all right. So he probably was put on the map for a lot of people through his book, Why Liberalism Failed. He does have a couple books prior to that as well, but that's the one that we're going to be talking about today, and that's the one that's particularly relevant to the subject that we're going to be talking about here. And then, as I said, he has a newer volume that's a follow-up to this, which is called Regime Change Toward a Post-Liberal Future, and that was released this year. Again, I have not read it, so I may perhaps read it. Well, I will definitely read it, but I may perhaps do something on that as well to evaluate or examine, talk about what his solution is to some of the issues that he diagnoses in this book. And then he has a Substack called The Post-Liberal Order. It's not just him. I believe he was the one who started it, or he was at least one of a couple people who started it. So if you're, online and you see people talking about post-liberalism or identifying themselves as post-liberals, that's what they're talking about here. He also is involved with the American Solidarity Party. He is on their board of advisors. And so his views are very influential upon the platform of the American Solidarity Party. And they have taken ideas from him, but that kind of shows you, if you're familiar with them, what kinds of things he is promoting in terms of his political policy. Now, as you know, if you've watched my channel enough and you've listened to the podcast, I don't talk about political policy. I try to leave that to the politicians, to those who are experts in political science, like Dr. Deneen. That is not my field. However, what I do like to talk about is some of the broader philosophical and theological issues that are involved in a lot of these conversations. So, as always, I'm not going to be endorsing candidates, I'm not going to be endorsing a party, and I am not going to be giving particular political policies. We're going to talk about some of the underlying philosophical issues here. Just want to make that clear. This doesn't mean that I'm part of the American Solidarity Party, though they do follow me on Twitter for whatever that's worth. Okay. All right. So, let's start talking about this book and what the actual thesis is of this work. Well, essentially, Deneen is going to outline a view of liberty that develops in the Enlightenment era that he is going to argue is distinct from the view of liberty that is present in the classical world or the classical era. And when he's speaking about the classical world, he has both two basic things in mind, and one of those is the Greeks primarily thinking of the Platonic and Aristotelian traditions in ancient Greece, coming through the birth of Christianity in Rome, and also the medieval West. And some of this is that he's a Roman Catholic. Roman Catholics tend to have quite positive views of the medieval West, which probably should not be all that surprising. So we're talking about the medieval period as well as the classical era. And he's going to argue that when you look at somebody like Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas, these people have a way to speak about liberty, but it's significantly different from the way that people like Rousseau or Locke or a lot of these Enlightenment thinkers start to describe exactly what liberty is. So Liberalism, if you think about the term liberalism, obviously it has libertas, it has liberty in the name, and that's purposeful because that's pretty definitional to what liberalism is. So we'll start to define some of what liberalism is. But he says here in this paragraph, I'm not going to read the entire thing. Okay, so these are lengthy paragraphs. You can, hopefully, if you can read this on the video, you can, because I know it's a little small. You can pause it and read the whole thing if you want, but I recommend you just read the whole book. So I tried to leave some of the locations in on the Nook ebook edition, which I know is never as easy to navigate as it is in a paperback, but oh well. All right. So he says, liberalism did not, of course, discover or invent the human longing for liberty. The word libertas is of ancient origin, and its defense and realization have been a primary goal from the first forays of political philosophy in ancient Greece and Rome. The foundational texts of the Western political tradition focused especially on the question of how to constrain the impulse to and assertions of tyranny, and characteristically settled upon the cultivation of virtue and self-rule as the key corrective to the tyrannical temptation. And so what Deneen is essentially going to argue here is that in a classical approach, liberty is not simply freedom to do whatever you feel like doing. That's what ends up developing in the era of the Enlightenment. But instead, liberty is freedom to, not just freedom from, freedom over the things that oppress you. And that also includes your base desires and sinful impulses. Now, of course, the Greeks aren't using the term sin, but that's really what, in Christian terms, as a theologian, that's what I'm going to do. But we have as people these kind of base impulses, these animal desires that are not always good. This is why we say gluttony is just giving into this desire to have something that tastes good all the time. If you sit around and eat chocolate cake and donuts all day, you may say, well, that's my personal freedom. If I choose to eat donuts all day and, get really fat and really unhealthy and die of a heart attack, I can do that if I feel like it. Well, in the classical world, they're going to understand that that's not really liberty. Okay, what that is really being a slave to your desires. A glutton is one who does not actually have the freedom or the ability of self-government, the freedom to be able to say no to those base impulses. So the one who is truly free is the one who is able to have a kind of self-control, and you are able to say, I may really want that extra donut, but I am consciously going to make a decision not to eat the extra donut because that is not ultimately what is going to be beneficial for me. So the notion of this kind of self-control, this idea of being able to constrain your inner impulses, not give in to your impulses, that is key to a classical approach to liberty. And so what Deneen is saying here is it's true that when we look at the Enlightenment, the emphasis on liberty is not something that just pops up out of nowhere. People have been talking about liberty and freedom, forever in the Western world, and this is key to the entirety of the Western political tradition. So if we're starting with Greece, we're talking Greece, Rome, Christian West, basically is what we're talking about through the Enlightenment. And we're talking about ancient Greece and Rome and the Christian West. They all have this other concept of liberty that we start to depart from. Now, to be clear, that doesn't mean there's no such things as, hedonists in the ancient world. Hedonism is an option. We even see groups of philosophers defending something like that. But that's not what's driving the best of the political theory of the Western world. And that's what starts to shift at the time of the Enlightenment. All right, so he's saying that this freedom, liberty, it does exist in the classical tradition. This does come from the very foundations of Western thought going back to ancient Greece. But the kind of freedom that they're talking about in the classical world, the kind of liberty they're talking about, is really centered on this kind of self-control or self-restraint. And that self-restraint for them is necessary to avoid tyranny. And so, again, that's another part of the Western political tradition, that there is a push against a kind of tyrannical governments. And so what Deneen is not going to say is that and I don't people misread this because I hear some talk about anyone who criticizes liberalism as if what you're really saying is we want a kind of fascist state or something. Not at all what he's talking about here. So he's not saying that we have to just simply have some Christian dictator to force everyone to act virtuously. That's not even really how virtue works. Doesn't make any sense. So that's not what he's going for. Okay. So then let's talk about that question of virtue a little more. And we have the image of St. Thomas Aquinas, who's a great representative here of the virtue ethics tradition, probably the most significant probably in the history of the church, at least in the Middle Ages, but maybe Augustine as well. So, okay, the Roman and the medieval Christian philosophical traditions retained the Greek emphasis upon the cultivation of virtue as a central defense against tyranny. So we have this emphasis on the cultivation of virtue and virtuous character. And virtue ethics, this would be a whole other discussion to get into the details of virtue ethics and what shifts in our ethical approaches in the Enlightenment. But a virtue ethic is an ethic that really focuses on inner character and the development of character. Virtue ethics is going to speak about habituation. You habituate yourself in practicing habits that are good, and as you practice good habits, you become kind of conformed to those good habits. And the goal of ethics is the inner character, not just the performance of moral duties like you find in the deontology of someone like Immanuel Kant. Or other systems that simply say that we just kind of do whatever we want, and there are no ethical norms at all. So, but this is the virtue ethics tradition is what he's talking about here. So he says that the Christian tradition here in the medieval period grabs onto this Greek emphasis on the cultivation of virtue, but also they develop institutional forms that sought to check the power of leaders, while to varying degrees opening routes to informal and sometimes formal expressions of popular opinion in political rule. Many of the institutional forms of government that we today associate with liberalism were at least initially conceived and developed over long centuries, preceding the modern age, including constitutionalism, separation of powers, separate spheres of church and state, rights and protections against arbitrary rule, federalism, rule of law, and limited government. So some of this does also, these kind of limitations do come really from some of the real fundamental characteristics of what Christians believe. And I talk about this in terms of Martin Luther's view of what he calls the three estates. And Luther doesn't come up with this out of nowhere because, of course, we see this distinction between spheres of authority that's certainly in the pre-Reformation church, but I think Luther's writings on the three estates are extremely helpful here. And what Luther does in talking about the different spheres that God has created for the world, for human society to live in, he says that there are basically three fundamental estates that we have, that we live in and through. One of those is the church, and in the church, Luther is going to say, God rules the church by means of the gospel. What he means is that the primary role of the church is to proclaim the gospel, deliver grace, deliver the forgiveness of sins, and empower us unto life everlasting. That's the primary role of the church. It is not the primary role of the church to punish evil in the civil sphere. That's not really the role of the church at all. But God has also created government, right? And the role of government is to watch over that civil sphere, especially in terms of what people do externally in the public arena. Not to say that the church is not in any sense public, because I know that the public-private division can be a bit iffy. It's not that strictly divided, I would say, but there is the politics essentially has a role in this public arena where the government can and does restrain evil. That's just biblical language, and that's the role that the government has. Luther also then says that there is this other estate, which is really the most foundational for social or public society, which is not the government, but it is the family. And so the family, the church, and the government are all three distinct, separate, and good institutions, but all of them have distinct, separate functions. So they all have to operate in their unique ways that they have been created to operate. And what that means is then that a society that is going to function properly in recognizing those three estates, there is going to be a clear limitation of the role of each of those estates. so that the church does not encroach upon what the government is doing in certain ways. And that's not to say there's no interaction. This is not Luther's view is not a pure, Enlightenment, freedom of religion in the way that we tend to think about it. They are deeply intertwined with one another, but they have distinctive spheres of authority and rule. So the church doesn't punish people and there is, excommunication, but it doesn't punish people in the civil sphere. It's not what it's called to do. And so it needs to stay in its proper lane, right? Proper sphere. The government is not there to be a church to tell you, what it is that you have to believe to try to convert the heart. It's not to say that the church or the state does not do some things to positively point people toward the good that is in the church. But it's not the role of the state to, say, make determinations about what is heresy and what is not. And it's also not the role, then, of the state to raise children. That is the role of the family. And when one of those spheres encroaches in those other spheres, this model of the three estates then gives us a way of distinguishing distinctive, unique roles and rules and authorities in each of those spheres to make sure that there's not one tyrannical authority that is reigning and ruling over all of it, because they're distinct. So Christianity has always done this in various ways. We could look at somebody like Thomas Aquinas here in his political theory, which is not exactly the same as where Luther's going to come from here. But within the Christian tradition, we understand that idea of distinctive authorities and accountability. So those things are not new with liberalism. The importance of that is to say that when you're critiquing liberalism, it is not the ultimately, that does not just mean automatically, if you're not on board with liberalism, therefore you are a tyrant or you're a fascist or something, or a socialist. But Deneen is saying, even prior to liberalism, we had a lot of these foundational things that liberalism does emphasize. So we don't have to say that these goods, like the separation of powers, is just the result of liberalism, so that if we're critiquing liberalism, we're taking away these things. He's saying that's part of the Western tradition as a whole, and it's certainly part, especially, of the Christian tradition. So let's talk, about then this idea of self-rule that he had already mentioned, that we had mentioned earlier. Now he says, liberty had long been believed to be the condition of self-rule that forestalled tyranny within both the polity and the individual soul. Liberty was thus thought to involve discipline and training in self-limitation and desires, and corresponding social and political arrangements that sought to indicate corresponding virtues that fostered the arts of self-government. So he's saying that here, in classical thought, you have this notion of self-restraint. So the truly free life, or what the Greeks would call the happy life, is the life that is well ordered, one in which you are able to control your desires. Now, we also have this shift in how we understand the word happiness, which is very much related to this, in that, if you go back and read, say, Ambrose, and Ambrose has a treatise, which is why I mention this because this is one of my favorites. It's called On Jacob and the Happy Life, which is a catechetical lecture that St. Ambrose gives, 4th century, where he is using Jacob as an illustration of virtue and talking about how it is to live a virtuous life. But that's the happy life. And when you hear that today, you think, oh, the happy life, that's the life that gives me good feelings. And happiness is not about feelings, but it's about fulfillment in a much bigger, fuller sense than just momentary pleasure. So happiness and pleasure are not to be identified with one another. So ultimate liberty is not simply doing whatever you please. And that way of defining the Enlightenment approach to liberty comes from Matthew Arnold. I love Matthew Arnold, and I think he's a great example of, if you want to read somebody who is from certainly a more conservative bent, culturally and religiously, kind of, but he's not a Christian, but he believes that the church is necessary for society. He's an interesting figure. But if you want to read his critique of some of this total, and absolute obsession with freedom as just doing whatever you want. I think it's a good parallel to what Deneen is doing here. So there are plenty of critics that have been making some of the same arguments in the past. And I think Arnold does a really good job at doing that when he talks about the problem of viewing liberty as just doing whatever you please. And he talks about the necessity of social structure and inheritance and ethical goodness and things like that. So then there's a mention here of Machiavelli. That's a statue of Machiavelli, by the way, in the slideshow here, if you're watching. Machiavelli proposed grounding a political philosophy upon readily observable human behaviors of pride, selfishness, greed, and the quest for glory. He argued further that liberty and political security were better achieved by pitting different domestic classes against one another, encouraging each to limit the others through ferocious conflict and the protection of their particular interests rather than by lofty appeals to a common good and political concord. So what happens so Machiavelli is the real first figure who's too clear about this. And I'm always hesitant to say first because there probably is somebody before that, but it's at least that I'm aware of. So, they've read everything in political philosophy. And I say this because I know if I say something like that, one of you is going to come and say something. Well, actually, no. So Machiavelli starts to move the conversation in politics from a conception that there is a common good. There's the ultimate good, which is God. Okay, so God is the ultimate good. And this is in the Christian West. Of course, we understand this, and I'm a Christian. I believe this is the triune God revealed in Scripture, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So the triune God is the ultimate good. And all things that God created have an end. They have a goal, which is conformity with that good. Now, how each institution might be conformed to that good, that is the triune God, may be different depending on what God created that thing to do or to be. And government, like anything else then, is oriented in a positive direction towards something. So the goal of government is to orient people toward that which is good. Now, there are plenty of conversations to have about that as to, well, how far do you take that? What exactly is the good that government does? Can you force people to be virtuous? Those kinds of questions. And there's plenty of room to debate within that, broader commitment. But what's important here is that commitment to say that there is a goal, a forward-orientedness to government, that it is serving a positive good. It is doing more than just stopping evil, though it does do that. I don't think anybody's going to say it doesn't do that. And if you look at Scripture, it's clear about that. Martin Luther says that God first instituted government with Cain, because Cain was given that mark to protect him, and all of a sudden there's a punishment that if he dies, someone else is going to die. So part of the role of government certainly is that restraint of evil. You have to have punishment to stop you from doing evil. But there also is a role of encouraging good behavior. And you see that in say, Romans 13, where the emperor, Paul's talking about Nero at the time, the emperor is said not only to punish evil, but also encourage good behavior. So there is also this positive element of government as well. With Machiavelli then, though, you get rid of this kind of goal-orientedness of government, that government is serving this greater good to push people towards something good. Instead, we start saying that, well, really, we're a bunch of selfish, crazy people, which, okay, fair enough. But I believe in original sin, where there's plenty of selfishness to go around. And it's probably one of the things that does work about liberalism is that it kind of does play off of people's selfishness and desire, which is a reality. We're sinful people, and that's a thing. So we do have that. But what Machiavelli does is kind of say, well, that's all there is. So what we need to do is come up with a theory or a political philosophy, theory of government, that is basically going to be built upon what we really know of humanity, which is the selfish, prideful, ruinous instincts of humanity and the kind of conflict that we have. In a way, it's a kind of giving up to say, well, we just keep messing this thing up, so let's just get rid of the whole common good thing anyway. This is obviously a very short abbreviation of Machiavelli. By the way, if you do want to delve more into these thinkers, in my Makers of the Modern World series, the next the next set of thinkers that I'm going to be delving into. I've dealt with some structuralists and post-structuralists, and I dealt with Marxism and neo-Marxism. I'm going to now go back and look at the foundational figures of liberalism. So if you want more detail on each of these thinkers, I'm going to be looking through some of their arguments, and that's going to be Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Rousseau, and Thomas Paine. I believe I'll do Thomas Paine. I just finished a book of his, and I think that's worth looking into because his service especially is a really good contrast to some other thinkers of the time, especially Edmund Burke, with the kind of back and forth the two of them had. All right. So then we have this, the nature of virtue and social structure. We tend to think, this is because of the rise of liberalism, but we tend to think in our context that virtue is maybe private, like ethics are, or something that is private, it's not public. We tend to think that ethics are something that we cultivate in our own inner hearts as persons if we choose to do so. We've privatized everything, but along with everything else, we've privatized virtue, we've privatized faith, we've privatized religion. And so when we think of virtue, then, we don't think of social virtue. We don't think of institutional virtue. We just think of your own inner character as an isolated self, and there's really nothing beyond that. So if you want to be virtuous, then go be virtuous, and that's just your thing. But if you want to go and be as unvirtuous as possible, go. That's your thing. Do whatever it is that you want to do. That really is so inconsistent with how virtue has been looked at in the classical world, how Christians have always looked at virtue. It's always been something that is communal. This is, it's not like the church was created just to produce virtue, but that's certainly something that occurs in the church, is that the church does create a community of individuals who are all struggling with sin, right? And forgiven, but also trying to produce virtue. And when you are in the company of people who are encouraging you and who are also virtuous in institutions that promote that kind of behavior, that's an essential element of you living a virtuous life. The majority of us are not going to live wonderful, virtuous lives all by ourselves with no connection to anyone else who has shared values with us. Okay, so you need some kind of virtuous or ethical community, and that's necessary even in areas where the church is persecuted and the government enforces things that are terrible. Is you still have house churches. You have communities that are necessary for the development of your character, and they're all school is part of this, and family is part of this as well. But he says here, this is the classical and Christian emphasis upon virtue in the cultivation of self-limitation, as we talked about, and self-rule. This is, by the way, why the church has seasons of the year where we, like Lent, where we fast. And there is this kind of idea I see in a lot of probably more reformed circles against fasting for a season like Lent. Because fasting is just this individual choice. It's not as authentic if you do it with other people, or it's being legalistic if you observe Lent and fast then. But this is how people grow. This is how people. We need discipline. Okay, it's easy for me to be like, oh yeah, well I fast when I want to, and then just to never do it, right? But once you have the structure and discipline there that says we have this season where everybody's fasting and we're all encouraging each other in it. Then you have this, you have the impetus to actually kind of forced, even if there's social pressure to do it, which social pressure can be a good thing, to fast, to practice self-limitation and control yourself. But in that kind of post-Enlightenment mindset that we have, we're often like, you tell me to do this, I don't want to then. And I get it, because I do the same thing, right? I get the impulse. It affects me too, so... All right. So he says, the self-rule relied upon reinforcing norms and social structures arrayed extensively through political, social, religious, economic, and familial life. What were viewed as the essential supports for training in virtue, and hence preconditions for liberty from tyranny, came to be viewed as sources of oppression, arbitrariness, and limitations. And we see this especially as we move into later, say, postmodern thinkers or some neo-Marxist thinkers as well. So the problem gets worse, but he sees the foundations really showing up all the way back. He starts to say in Descartes. So we're talking the beginnings of modernity, the first of modern philosophy, as Descartes is often said to be. But Charron actually influences Descartes significantly. I don't think Descartes does this alone, but he's the major figure. So Descartes and Hobbes, in turn, argued that the rule of irrational custom and unexamined tradition, especially religious beliefs and practice, was a source of arbitrary governance and unproductive internecine conflicts, and thus an obstacle to a stable and prosperous regime. And so what happens is that at this time, with the rise of modernity, there is a concern that traditional institutions, traditional structures, traditional rituals are a kind of hindrance to your own development of character. Now, Descartes wasn't quite a virtue ethicist. He actually did have a virtue. He did develop his own system of ethics, or at least started to, but it wasn't particularly influential, like some other thinkers after him were. So we see that shift then already away from social structure and norms into the inner self already with Descartes. Got a whole talk on Descartes. Actually, 2 talks on Descartes if you want to watch those. It's about 2 hours in my Makers of the Modern World series, if you want to hear more about that. Okay. But let's stop there. We've talked about a bit of the problems. Let's stop just looking at the problems and say, Deneen is willing to say that there are things that liberalism, does get right. He's not going to say, and it would be, very irresponsible and unwise for him to say that everything coming from liberalism is bad. And, to be clear, I'm an American. My family, my ancestors were very involved in the founding of this country. I have a great uncle that, many greats, uncle, however many greats, that wrote the Pennsylvania State Constitution, and another one that wrote the New Jersey State Constitution. And the one who wrote the Pennsylvania State Constitution was also the author of the Declaration of Independence. And by author, I mean actual penman. He didn't actually come up with the words, but he wrote them down, which is kind of cool. So, and my family's been in the northeastern U.S. for forever. We got Mayflower ancestors, all that stuff, and so I'm very happy with living in the United States. I'm very grateful for the benefits of the United States. I support a lot of principles that are here in the United States. So I don't want you to hear me as saying that I think everything about, say, the U.S. founding is bad. However, we do have to be very careful in the adoption of a kind of naivety of U.S. American political theory, which would say that the United States was some kind of purely Christian nation and our founders were all just taking principles from biblical Orthodox Christianity. That's just not the case. Were some of the founders, Orthodox in their faith? Of course, but more of them weren't. I mean, a lot of them were Enlightenment, rationalists and Enlightenment deists, Unitarians. So that does affect certain assumptions. And within the early U.S., I'm not going to get too far into this discussion, but there are some kind of competing ideas about liberalism and about constitutional government. There is an approach that tends to be quite individualistic, one that really is the kind of most kind of bland adherence to social contract theory. If you don't know the details, we'll delve into that as we move on through this. But if you look at someone like, Thomas Jefferson, he's a good example of that. But really, Thomas Paine is probably the most clear. And he's not in the U.S., but his book Common Sense is very influential. You may have read it. I read parts of it in school. But in that kind of approach that someone like Thomas Paine has, there really is no room for inherited tradition at all. I mean, Paine basically says every generation needs to just kind of remake their governmental social contract, and you can whenever you feel like, and you're not bound to anything anyone prior to you ever did. It's pretty like extreme. And so you have that, and then you have Burke on the other hand. So when you look at someone like Edmund Burke, there is respect for inheritance, a love of tradition. So there are these kind of competing ideas, and I think Burke and Paine represent those competing ideas. So I want to be clear about that as I'm talking about some of these issues. What I'm not trying to say is that everything about the American founding, everything was bad. I'm not saying that at all. But we do have to evaluate some of the basic assumptions that some of our founders certainly did have, and ideas that do impact the way that we think today. Okay, so liberalism does get some things right. Now, some of the things that liberalism gets right, according to Deneen, are the things that he has already mentioned that are also part of the prior tradition. And I think this is probably mostly where Deneen tends to go, is that he tends to see the things that liberalism did well were really not from liberalism at all. They were just inherited from earlier thinkers. And maybe that's not fair to say that's only the case. But he does go on to say, there are some things that are positive. So he says this: in this regard, liberalism is rightly considered to be based on essential political commitments that were developed over centuries in classical and Christian thought and practice. Yet, liberalism's innovations, ones that its architects believed would more firmly secure human liberty and dignity, which consisted especially of a redefinition of the ideal of liberty and a reconception of human nature, so we'll go back to that, have undermined the realization of its stated commitments. Moving beyond liberalism is not to discard some of liberalism's main commitments, and that's important, especially those deepest longings of the West, political liberty and human dignity, but to reject the false turn it made in its imposition of an ideological remaking of the world in the image of a false anthropology. And this question of anthropology, with philosophical and theological anthropology, is going to be pretty important as we start to look at a lot of the ideas that arise out of liberalism. And it's become a significant challenge for the church, because there is an anthropology that arises and develops in all different ways today. And I think of like the kind of post-structuralist anthropologies out there that really do deny that there is some kind of real essence of human nature, some kind of clear humanity, some kind of clear nature that we share as human beings at all. So that's going to be a question that a lot of people are going to have through liberalism. And of course, we have to challenge that. As a Christian, I certainly have to challenge that. Okay, so and this is something to just clearly say this again. When we're talking about politics in this broad sense here, this is not a religiously neutral sphere. Because I know there's always pushback if I mention anything politics, but it's not a religiously neutral sphere. It's not that the ideas of the Enlightenment are just kind of taken for granted, bland, secular ideas. The notion of a pure secular state is really a novelty with the Enlightenment. And so we have to get out of this mindset that the state is just some neutral, non-committal sphere that cannot legislate morality. The whole point of government is to legislate morality. That's why it exists. If you agree with Luther that the killing or the protection of Cain is the foundation of government, well, why was the death penalty enacted? Well, to legislate morality, because killing people is immoral, so it should be legislated. That's the whole point. Now, obviously, there are limits to it, right? What legislating morality means and how far do you go? That's the question we have to wrestle with. And what is the proper role of state? How should it go? And that, once you get into that, then I hand it off to the political theorists to deal with that. But in terms of the basic question of should you legislate morality, of course you should legislate morality. The government makes no sense if you're not legislating morality. All right. So let's move on to talk about this idea of the state of nature. And let me just quickly define what this idea of a state of nature is. Now, the founders of liberalism, and the foundation of liberalism often is said to be in Thomas Hobbes. It actually, the language of rights doesn't start with Hobbes. So in some ways, liberalism precedes Hobbes, but in some other ways, Hobbes really isn't a liberal at all in many ways, because he kind of argues for what essentially is a kind of tyrannical government. But what Hobbes does in his book Leviathan to establish what we generally think of as liberal political theory is that he sets the groundwork for how the discussion basically works, what the manner of proceeding with developing a theory of government or state, what it looks like. And that is that Hobbes begins his thoughts about the role of government with kind of hypothesizing what man is like in a pure state of nature. And this state of nature, depending on the political philosopher, it can be spoken of either as a historical reality of there was a time when there was no government, let's speculate on what that was and how government was founded, or it could be, in many thinkers, it's really just a kind of theoretical exercise, not really we really believe man had this state because who knows, but it's a theoretical, what if there was no government? What would man be like? And Hobbes, famously says that the life of man prior to the state, in the state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short. So that without government, essentially humanity is endlessly selfish. And this obsession with selfishness and government and individual liberty really does come out of this with Hobbes. But man is essentially selfish. And of course, a lot of this is very true in how Christianity looks at the world too. So we talk extensively about human selfishness. The whole Augustinian tradition of the West comes from this as well. So you do see this with liberalism. It does have almost all of its ideas have a root within Christianity, but they go in directions that are wildly different from Christianity in ways that I think cause a lot of the issues that we see with liberalism. So he's certainly not wrong to say that humanity is selfish. But because of his emphasis on human selfishness, he comes up with this idea that essentially the state's role is really to come in as this kind of leviathan, this monster to stop people from just killing one another. So the role of the state really is to just restrain people from destroying each other. So that's kind of all it is. But what happens is that you start to have these political theories that are really based on pure abstraction. And this abstraction is, well, theoretically, what is humanity? Theoretically, what is the state of humankind? And then we look at what the state of humankind was, and then we start to think like, okay, in that sphere, what would the role of government be? So it's all kind of just abstract and theoretical. And this is the criticism that Edmund Burke is going to have of a lot of these theories, is that it's so ahistorical that we have no access to some abstract state of nature that we're theorizing about. If you're in a society, you're in that society, and that society exists with its institutions, and you have inheritance, you have values of that society. You don't get to just kind of have these, theoretical kind of pie in the sky ideas about what the government should be, and then just say, well, let's try to do that. You work with what you've inherited and what you've got. And Burke deals with this with the French Revolution, because that's essentially what the French Revolution tried to do, and it was an utter disaster, as he predicted it would be. So Deneen is referencing that idea of the state of nature here, where he says, ironically, but perhaps not coincidentally, the political project of liberalism is shaping us into the creatures of its prehistorical fantasy, which, in fact, require the selves replete with rights and defined by our liberty, but insecure, powerless, afraid, and alone. So what he's saying here is that this idea of the state of nature, without these social bonds, because Hobbes is essentially saying social bonds aren't inherent to humanity, because humans are by nature selfish, and if we are by nature selfish, we are by nature individuals. We're kind of basically forced into communities. That's not essential to who we are as people. And that he's saying that liberalism leads us back essentially into that position where we are these isolated, selfish selves that Hobbes talked about in the state of nature. Now, let me just, and I have a lot more on here, and it looks like I'm looking at the time here, and I'm close to being done. So one other thing, though, that I do want to talk about before before finishing here, and we'll continue this. I got a lot more to say on this issue, and like I said, we'll be looking into some individual thinkers in the Makers of the Modern World series. That's coming up soon. And let me know what you think about this series. If you want to see more of this, or if you're like, this is boring, that's fine. Let me know too. And I also recognize not everybody's interested in everything that I do. So certain topics are like you have no interest in, and that's all right. You don't have to listen to those. Just watch and listen to the things you are interested in, instead of telling me how much you hate when I talk about, whatever. You don't have to listen to it. All right. So I want to talk just briefly about social contract theory, because that's going to be key for the entire liberal project if you're not familiar with what social contract theory is. Now, there are different approaches to social contract theory. There's Rousseau's The Social Contract. John Locke's approach to social contract theory is probably going to be the most influential in terms of the United States. Rousseau and Locke are pretty different in some ways, too. Rousseau is not as friendly to Christianity, I would say, as Locke is in his beliefs about a lot of things. Rousseau's kind of the anti-Augustine, I think and he sets himself up basically that way. So, but social contract theory, in short, if I could just summarize the whole thing, so you know what social contract theory is. Essentially, it's an approach to government which says that there is a kind of state of nature where people are naturally self-interested, and they are these isolated individual selves, and in their own self-interest, it is better to have some kind of laws, because if you have no laws, people can just steal stuff from you. So you have, everybody has these rights to do what they want. However, everyone with unrestricted rights and no restraint at all starts to harm one another. So it's in my self-interest, in other words, to say, make a contract or an agreement with somebody to say, hey, why don't we just both make a mutual agreement that we don't hurt each other? Because that's going to benefit me and it's going to benefit you. Because you can keep your stuff, I can keep my stuff, and then we don't have to be constantly, watching around the corner to see if you're going to attack me. So government is formed for the specific purpose of maximizing liberty. And so the government's role is to restrain only insofar as that restraint is going to preserve my liberty. Because my liberty is better preserved if there is a law against, murder, so I don't have to worry about somebody, killing me and taking my liberty away. Or burning my house down or whatever. So we have to have things like property rights in order to secure our freedom. And so government, in that perspective, and the social contract view, is not something that is divinely ordered. It is not a, say, earthly display of something that is a real transcendent structure. Because in older views of government, and this is not just Christian views, this is pagan views as well, Jewish views, pretty much every culture has a view that says that there is a basically transcendent order, a religious order, essentially is what we're talking about, heavenly, something apart from the earthly. And the earthly order is actually grounded upon the transcendent. So the reason why we can say that any earthly authority has actual authority is because a transcendent order has granted authority to that earthly authority. But within liberalism, you destroy or get rid of the transcendent order altogether. All you have is just a bunch of material people that are free and have rights who decide to make a contract with each other, and that's what government is. So you see how the foundations of social contract theory are really not consistent with a Christian view of reality, because it's a view that says that all culture is, all society is a bunch of people that can make free decisions to do whatever they want with one another, and they just so happen to come together in a kind of contract for the benefit of the self. So it's self-oriented rather than government and society being God-oriented in ordering itself toward virtue, toward something which is good, and pointing at something that is beyond itself. Well, that's the end of this first part of this discussion of Deneen's book. And I hope you learned something from it, and hopefully this will stir some interesting thoughts. Feel free to disagree with me on this. That's fine. I'd like to hear your thoughts, as long as you're not just calling me names. I guess you can if you want, but it's not going to do any good. But we'll see you in the next one. Make sure you subscribe if you have not yet on YouTube and your podcast app. Thanks. God bless.